Previously on Theology Today, we witnessed the explosive birth of the New Side movement, where the fires of the Great Awakening split the Presbyterian Church down the middle. We saw the firebrand Gilbert Tennent cool his former censorious zeal, stepping into the breach as a mature peacemaker to steer his fractured denomination away from perpetual conflict and toward a grueling diplomatic marathon. But passion without order breeds chaos. To survive on the expanding frontier, the maturing church needed something more, a robust, transparent framework of law. As the Synod of New York matured, its leaders recognized that long-term survival required a robust, transparent framework of church law to prevent a descent into anarchy. To achieve this, the Synod established a comprehensive series of governance protocols designed to protect personal conscience while enforcing structural order. Central to this system was a strict prohibition against unilateral public character assassination. The Synod's foundational articles mandated that no minister could publicly accuse a fellow presbyter of doctrinal heresy or moral failure unless those grievances were formally filed through the appropriate established rules of judicial discipline. This mechanism effectively silenced the reckless public denunciations that had characterized the early years of the revival, forcing interpersonal and theological conflicts into the orderly arena of church courts. Furthermore, the Synod introduced an innovative approach to collective decision-making that sought to balance majority rule with absolute respect for individual conscience. Under their constitutional agreement, every member promised to either actively support or passively submit to any ecclesiastical judgment determined by a majority vote of the body. However, if a minister's deeply held theological convictions prevented him from doing either, he was not summarily excommunicated or vilified. Instead, the rules obligated him to peaceably and quietly withdraw from synodical communion without attempting to instigate a new schism or hostile division, provided that the synod judged the matter in question to be an essential point of Christian doctrine or discipline. This legal safety valve preserved the peace of the institution while honoring the ultimate liberty of the individual conscience. In terms of functional administration, the Synod of New York closely mirrored the traditional customs of the Church of Scotland by employing a powerful executive governing apparatus known as the Commission of the Synod. This standing committee was formally appointed on an annual basis and was fully clothed with absolute synodical powers during the long intervals between the full synod's yearly meetings. The commission served as an agile, authoritative executive branch, enabling the church to respond swiftly to emergencies, settle boundary disputes, and manage pressing pastoral concerns without waiting for the entire General Assembly to convene. Beyond this central commission, both the Synod and its constituent presbyteries heavily relied on a highly flexible system of special committees endowed with plenary powers to adjudicate localized ecclesiastical dilemmas. For example, when a German-speaking congregation at Rockaway formally petitioned to be received under the care of the Synod, the body did not delay the request. Instead, they immediately dispatched a specialized committee to visit the locality, investigate the factual circumstances, and render a binding decision on the application. This localized method of acting via targeted committees was utilized even more extensively within the individual presbyteries, where candidates were routinely examined, licensed, ordained to the ministry, and dismissed to new charges by specially designated committees. This administrative agility proved to be an immense operational advantage, allowing the new side to adapt to the rapidly expanding colonial frontier with far greater efficiency than their old side counterparts. The organizational wisdom and flexible governance of the Synod of New York yielded spectacular practical results. This specific administrative strategy immediately triggered an era of explosive institutional expansion. While the old side languished in bureaucratic stagnation, the new side synod experienced a remarkable numerical boom. The church watched its active ministerial roster climb from a modest 22 pastors at its founding in 1745 to an impressive 73 ministers by 1758. This rapid multiplication was fueled by the Synod's aggressive evangelistic outlook and its warm embrace of geographic mobility. Furthermore, the governance provided the structural capacity to absorb the massive waves of spiritually awakened converts generated by the ongoing revivals. The leaders of the Synod quickly realized that this immense growth would soon sputter without a steady supply of new leaders. Consequently, they turned their full attention toward higher education to cultivate spiritually vibrant pastors. For years, the undivided church had debated the establishment of a formal seminary. However, the catastrophic schism of 1741 had rendered it impossible for the new side ministers to participate in the original college plans envisioned by the unified body. New side leaders engaged in a flurry of intense correspondence and collaborative conferences during the volatile 3-year window between their expulsion and the formal organization of the new synod. These urgent strategic meetings were aimed entirely at erecting an independent institution of higher learning. The historical answer to this pressing need arrived at a critical providential juncture. William Tennent's rustic but historic log college in Neshaminy was preparing to close its doors permanently. Upon the school's closure, the patrons, alumni, and passionate defenders of that academy transferred their collective energy toward a grander vision. They immediately redirected their resources and institutional loyalty to secure the future of the ministry. In 1747, this dedicated coalition successfully secured a royal charter from the crown. This legal milestone allowed them to officially establish the College of New Jersey. The foundational supporters of the Log College became the primary trustees and financial pillars of this new enterprise. This shift made the humble Wilderness Academy the direct ideological germ from which the flourishing new college proceeded. In 1752, the College of New Jersey permanently relocated to its iconic home in Princeton. From this central location, it rapidly evolved into British North America's premier Reformed seminary. Cradled in the fiery spiritual experiences of the Great Awakening, the institution was built upon a sophisticated dual mandate. The trustees remained unconditionally committed to a generous, vibrant understanding of the Reformed faith in all theological matters. The faculty was equally determined to provide an exceptional classical education for every attending student. This curriculum positioned the school at the absolute cutting edge of 18th century secular knowledge. Princeton provided the Synod of New York with an elite intellectual training ground by brilliantly synthesizing the finest analytical tools of the Enlightenment. This rigorous system combined academic scrutiny with the experiential, warm-hearted piety of historic Calvinism. This strategic academic balance ensured that the next generation of new side ministers would be both spiritually alive. Furthermore, it guaranteed they would be intellectually formidable leaders in the surrounding culture. These highly trained scholars entered the frontier thoroughly prepared for service. Their widespread ministry fundamentally reshaped the cultural landscape of the American colonies. While the Synod of New York enjoyed an era of unprecedented institutional vitality, its rival, the anti-awakening Synod of Philadelphia, suffered a period of profound stagnation and numerical decay. This stark institutional divergence between the two bodies during the 17 years of their separation offers a compelling case study in ecclesiastical sociology. At the dawn of the schism in 1745, the old side actually held a slight numerical advantage, boasting 27 active ministers compared to the new side's 22. However, by the time the two factions finally initiated serious reunion talks in 1758, the Synod of Philadelphia's roster had actually shrunk to just 22 pastors, while the new side had more than tripled its strength. Throughout nearly 2 decades of isolation, the old side remained utterly stationary, trapped in a defensive, bureaucratic posture that failed to replace its aging clergy. They completely failed to capture the imagination of the rapidly evolving colonial public. The clear and decisive superiority of the Synod of New York was not merely a matter of raw data. It was fundamentally driven by a superior level of evangelistic zeal, moral weight, and an exceptional capacity for securing new ministerial candidates. The vibrant, warm-hearted spiritual culture of the New Side acted as a powerful magnet, attracting a massive percentage of young candidates. Based purely on their geographical location, these men naturally should have aligned with the Philadelphia Judicatory. The Old Side's rigid insistence on institutional conformity and their vocal hostility toward experimental piety effectively alienated the younger generation of theological students. These young scholars increasingly viewed the Philadelphia Synod as an obsolete monument to Old World traditionalism rather than a living vehicle for gospel ministry. Furthermore, geography and shifting immigration patterns heavily favored the New Side's strategic positioning. During the mid-18th century, New England had increasingly become the primary incubator and exporter of Protestant ministers in the colonies. Because the presbyteries of New York and New Brunswick sat directly adjacent to these eastern provinces, they were uniquely positioned to welcome, examine, and absorb the steady stream of candidates. These young, revival-educated preachers were migrating south out of Yale and Harvard. The Old Side, isolated in its rigid anti-revival enclaves further south, was structurally and ideologically cut off from this vital supply chain of human talent. This isolation ensured their steady decline, while the New Side captured the cultural and spiritual center of American Presbyterianism. The path toward denominational restoration was a grueling, multi-decade diplomatic marathon that required a profound generational shift and a mutual cooling of theological passions. Following the untimely death of Jonathan Dickinson in 1747, the leadership of the New York Synod's peace initiatives passed into the hands of a more mature, deeply reflective Gilbert Tennent. Recognizing that the perpetual fragmentation of the church was dishonoring to the Christian faith and destructive to the Reformed witness, Tennent used his immense moral authority to champion the cause of unity. Noting with optimism that a genuine spirit of moderation was steadily growing among the rank-and-file members of both synods, the New York Judicatory formally approached the Synod of Philadelphia, with peaceable terms aimed at resolving their long-standing impasse. The initial diplomatic breakthrough occurred when an officially appointed joint commission representing both synods convened in Trenton, New Jersey, to chart a path forward. Though the early sessions were marked by tense interactions and familiar grievances, the delegates successfully agreed that any permanent settlement must directly address three core structural pillars: the redrawing of overlapping presbytery boundaries, the legal status of the 1741 protestation that had originally expelled the New Brunswick Brethren, and most crucially, a mutual agreement regarding the exact interpretation of the original subscription principles of 1729, commonly referred to as that paragraph about essentials. Despite this early structural progress, the negotiations repeatedly stalled over deeply entrenched institutional anxieties. The Synod of Philadelphia fiercely resisted affirming the Essentials Clause of the 1729 Adopting Act, arguing that granting ministers the constitutional right to express personal scruples over non-essential doctrines possessed an unsafe aspect and opened a dangerous door for unjustifiable latitude in both theological principles and pastoral practices. Furthermore, the Old Side remained highly defensive and initially flatly refused to join the New Side in issuing any public cooperative statement validating the Great Awakening as a genuine work of God. For years, these ideological battle lines held firm, but the steady pressure of the New Side's explosive growth and the fading memories of the original 1740 conflicts slowly wore down the Old Side's resistance, setting the stage for a historic ecclesiastic compromise. The definitive breakthrough in the prolonged reunion discussions finally occurred when the Synod of Philadelphia issued a historic clarifying letter that dismantled the primary legal roadblock to peace. In this communication, the Old Side leadership explicitly addressed the lingering trauma of the original 1741 split, stating clearly and reassuringly that they neither adopted nor did they design to adopt that original protestation as a binding term of ministerial communion. They further affirmed that their only intention was to adhere strictly to their shared subordinate standards as they had formerly agreed upon when united as a single body. This crucial concession allowed both factions to save face, effectively nullifying the punitive legacy of the expulsion without forcing the old side into a humiliating public retraction. With the fierce personal passions generated by the initial revivals having naturally subsided over the course of 17 years, and with Gilbert Tennent actively maintaining a highly conciliatory stance, the old and new sides finally reunited in 1758 to form the combined Synod of New York and Philadelphia. This historic reunion was achieved almost entirely on new side terms, representing a total vindication of the principles that had birthed the Synod of New York 13 years prior. The newly consolidated church officially adopted the less restrictive new side interpretation of confessional subscription, rejecting the rigid literalism of the old side in favor of a pastoral system that prioritized core evangelical doctrines while respecting individual conscience. Furthermore, the unified body explicitly accepted the fundamental authenticity and spiritual blessing of the Great Awakening, formally designating it as a truly gracious work of God, even while issuing sober, measured pastoral cautions designed to guard congregations against counterfeit revivals and emotional fanaticism. The final constitutional formula adopted by the unified church permanently cemented this balanced identity. The decree stated that both synods, having always received and approved the Westminster Confession of Faith, and the larger and shorter catechisms as an orthodox and excellent system of Christian doctrine founded on the Word of God, would continue to receive the same as the sole confession of their faith. Through this definitive treaty of peace, the structural innovations of the 1745 Synod of New York became the permanent blueprint for American Presbyterianism, successfully merging a rigorous defense of Reformed orthodoxy with a warm, adaptive commitment to experiential evangelical piety. The historical fracture and eventual healing of the colonial Presbyterian Church forces us to look closely at our own modern spiritual communities. It is easy to judge the fierce passions of the past, but we often repeat the same mistakes by prioritizing rigid institutional control over vital living faith, or by letting emotional zeal blind us to the value of order and intellectual discipline. As you consider the delicate balance achieved by the Synod of New York, take a moment to ponder how these historical lessons apply to your own spiritual journey. Are you currently prioritizing cold religious traditionalism over a vibrant experiential relationship with Christ? How can your community encourage passionate, heartfelt revival without sacrificing intellectual rigor and structural order? What steps can you personally take to act as a voice for healthy moderation and reconciliation in a deeply polarized world? Join us next week as we continue our journey through church history by exploring another fascinating and fiercely independent branch of Presbyterianism, the Covenanters and the Seceders. We will examine how these distinct groups brought their own unique heritages of dissent, political resistance, and theological precision from Scotland into the American frontier. Do not miss this upcoming discussion as we unwrap how their structural battles and deeply held principles further shape the diverse landscape of colonial faith. If you want to keep exploring the deep, transformative history of Christian thought and denomination building, make sure to support our work by subscribing to Theology Today. By subscribing to this YouTube channel, clicking the notification bell, and liking our videos, you help us bring these vital historical narratives and theological deep dives to life each week. Join our growing digital community of thinkers and believers today so you never miss an episode of Theology Today.